So I'm going to go kind of fast. You're all thinking ahead to the practical. You realize that there are only 3 lectures left, and that, I'm counting this one. Right? You all realize it's that fast. It really is going to go that fast. It's today and Thursday and then Tuesday, and then the Thursday after that we're supposed to be reviewing for the final. And you all know that your final is Tuesday of the week after that, right? So we'll review on Thursday, and it'll be Tuesday of the week after that, and that's the very end. And of course, we've got lab at night, and then next week at this time, for most of you, I'm going to be checking your notebooks, and you'll be taking the second practical, and that's the end. So it really is, we're right down to the wire here. One last little thing. Remember I asked you guys to all go do an evaluation? Thanks to the 4 people out of 48 that did it. And the rest of you go in and do it? Because they sent us a little sheet that showed how many people in our classes have done it. Most instructors have somewhere between 0 and 3. You guys were like 4. Woohoo! 4. But there's like 48 of you. You realize that's going to close on Friday. You cannot do it after Friday, right? Can you all go do it? Okay, so you might remember where I left off. We were talking first about, ecology, right, which is this very broad field, and we were talking about distributions or ranges, what different abiotic and biotic factors affect why certain species are found in some places and not others, right? And then we sort of left off when we hit this spot about biomes, which are life zones, or you can almost think of them as kind of like types of ecosystems. There is no one way to divide these up and talk about them. I'm following Campbell's method, and probably in the fall I'm going to switch to doing Brooker's, because by then everybody, or most people, will have Brooker instead of Campbell. But Campbell's really similar to Brooker. You'll see. I even have a picture here that, in a minute, that shows the different terrestrial biomes. The way Brooker presents them, you'll see that it's almost exactly the same. But there is no right or wrong way to do this, really. So let's start first with the aquatic biomes, right? And I think I mentioned last time that these are characterized by physical features of the biome more so than they are by the life forms that are there. When we get to the terrestrial biomes, they're really characterized more by vegetation type usually, which of course is attributable to some type of climactic or precipitation, different types of patterns, weather patterns more that you would associate with them, but that usually determine the vegetation type. But when we talk about them in terms of vegetation. These we talk more about the physical environment. So for example, if I asked you the difference between a stream and an ocean, you start to describe like the salinity of the water and how much water and how deep it is. And you'd start to talk about the water rather than talking about a particular life form that's there. I mentioned also this idea of stratification, that especially for aquatic biomes, they tend to exist in layers. They're very vertical biomes. And so it's important to keep focus on those layers, right? If you have a lake, we talked about that in an aquatic biome, the light is near the surface. That's the photic zone. If you go very deep in the water, you lose light very quickly. So if you're photosynthetic, you need to be near the surface. And I also mentioned this problem of most of the nutrients, things like nitrogen and phosphorus that you need for photosynthetic organisms, are mostly in bottom sediments, right? So at some point you have to periodically bring sediments to the surface in order for photosynthetic organisms to have both nutrients and light. Because if they're photosynthetic, they really can't be below the photic zone at all. And then you also have differences as to whether or not you're out in the middle of the lake or close to the shore, right? Those are different types of habitats, and that's going to determine the different biome types we're going to have. And an ocean is very similar. The main difference with an ocean system is that you typically have tides, so you have an intertidal zone that's partially exposed during the day, and then you also can have really great depths, so that you can have these like abyssal zones where you have hydrothermal vents, and obviously pressure increases dramatically, temperature drops dramatically as you start to go really deep, and so they're very extreme types of biomes compared to what you'd probably get in a lake. And I mentioned this a little bit last time, specialization of different algae to maximize photosynthetic ability at different depths underwater. And this is sort of where I left off, this idea of thermal inversion, that periodically you have basically cold, nutrient-rich water being brought to the surface through this process of thermal inversion. It's also called upwelling, and like off the coast of California, Monterey, when we have the big red tides, the algal blooms, it's correlated with upwelling, when you bring these nutrient-rich sediments up to the surface, and then the algae just go berserk, because that's basically the only thing that's holding them back, is they don't have enough nitrogen and phosphorus. Okay, so here we go through the aquatic biome. Ready? So this is a lake, right? And Campbell sort of divides lakes into these two different types of lakes. A lake that's oligotrophic and a lake that is eutrophic. So an oligotrophic lake, you'd imagine you're up in the mountains, you've got some kind of a glacier that's just carved out a new lake, and you've got pristine water in there with basically nothing, right? Few little organisms that might have migrated in, but a very, very clean lake. As opposed to a eutrophic lake, it's going to be one like this that's full of water lilies and sedges and tons of animals, lots of biological activity, both in the form of photosynthetic activity and decomposition, right? So an oligotrophic lake is very nutrient poor. There's not much in the way of organic matter here, but it's very oxygen rich because there's not a whole lot of decomposition going on. And in a eutrophic lake, we would say that it's nutrient rich, but it's rather oxygen poor because, of course, you have all this biological activity that's consuming oxygen. And lakes being distinguished from other aquatic biomes in the sense that they have standing water. There are these different zones, right? So the littoral zone would be close to the shore, the limnitic zone would be out in the middle, right? And this is going to be very generic. You could have little plants along the shoreline, and you could have different floating things out in the limnitic zone. Benthic zones would be anywhere on the bottom, right? And there'd be a whole bunch of different vertebrates, and then you'd have fish kind of all over the place. So that's a lake. This is a marsh or wetland, right? Wetlands themselves could be divided up into different types of biomes. That's why I'm saying this is kind of artificial, right? It's just the way Campbell decided to do it. So wetlands, because they're very eutrophic, right, they tend to have low oxygen levels. They tend to typically have a lot of biological activity. There are different types of wetlands, like basin wetlands that are just sort of like little shallow lakes, riverine wetlands that are riparian along the edges of river banks, fringe wetlands, which are actually just on the edge of like a larger lake. So you got a lake in the middle and wetlands around the edge. And Campbell would count those as two different biome types. They can be very highly productive, right? There's a lot of biological activity. Floating pans, woody plants, you know, everything from all different kinds of invertebrates, otters, alligators. A lot of birds have used wetlands as nesting grounds. They're important in that respect. These are rivers and streams, right? So here, unlike the wetlands and the lakes, the water is moving, right? It's going downhill. So you have currents, it's turbulent. The water is typically colder because it's constantly moving and being replaced with water that's coming from further upstream, right? They tend to be clear because sediments get washed away, right? Moving water holds a lot of oxygen. Cold water holds more oxygen, right? So kind of keep that in mind. You know, like when you put a little air stone, your tank goes bubble, 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 bubble. What you're really doing is you're just breaking the surface tension, and that keeps the water oxygenated. When the little air stone goes off and the goldfish comes up to the top, right? And this is why goldfish like cold water ponds and things like that too, because colder water holds more oxygen than warmer water. They don't like it when it gets too warm because the oxygen content in the water decreases. The salinity obviously increases as you move downstream because you're picking up sediments. Because it's moving, right? Because it's relatively cold, you have high oxygen contents. You end up with silty sediments that build up as it moves along, picking things up. And there's all kinds of little phytoplankton and fish and invertebrates you'd find in a river or stream. This is and where does that look like we are? It's kind of like river. It's like the Mountain River. It looks kind of like Mississippi Delta or something like that, right? This is an estuary. It's a place where a river comes into the ocean, right? This is like Louisiana, basically a big estuary. You have a mixing of fresh and salt water. You have tidal fluctuations here. There's lots of variation in salinity. But you're bringing down all of these sediments that have been carried by a river, so these can be very, very productive biomes, right? I mean, if you think of what comes out of like the Mississippi Delta, you got all these, right? Oysters and crabs and shrimp and all this kind of stuff that they're harvesting there, you know, when it's not covered.
Pollution.
Yeah, when it's not being polluted, it's very productive, right? And then, of course, there's, again, these are really important breeding grounds for a lot of birds, right? So it could be a very productive system, but you have animals and plants, notice, that are really highly adapted to this variation in salinity. And very often we say that they're brackish, right? Or they live in brackish water. Brackish water is just a mixture of fresh and salt water, right? Okay, this is probably not Florida. This is somewhere like in California. This looks very familiar to me. This is an intertidal zone, right? This happens to be a rocky intertidal. There's lots of oxygen, lots of nutrients, lots of oxygen, because these little guys are actually exposed like half the day. The tides go out, like it is in this picture, but then the tides come in, everybody's underwater, and then the tides go out. Obviously, that can happen, you know, like a couple times a day. You have 2 high tides, 2 low tides, right? So these guys have to be really good at being able to just like sit exposed out of the water for a while and then be submerged under the water another part of the day. Intertidals can be rocky or sandy. This is rocky, right? The salinity and temperature variations, as you might imagine, are extreme. It's physically tumultuous. You have these waves coming in and crashing constantly, so you got to hang on, right? These guys, like the little byssal threads that mussels make and stuff to cement themselves to rocks, are like amongst the strongest glue-like substances known, right? Little barnacles, all these little algae have holdfast. I mean, everybody is just a master of hanging on for dear life, because otherwise you get washed out to sea. There's a whole diverse assemblage of macroalgae and seagrasses, and then all kinds of invertebrates and fish and stuff that you find in these little tide pools in these rocky intertidal areas. Notice that the real limiting factor for these guys is space. It's just a very narrow little zone that's right along the edge of the ocean, and there's just not a lot of it there. And so you can tell everybody on here, everywhere, once in a while you see a little bit of bare rock, but for the most part everything is covered, and everybody's just trying to figure out how to crowd everybody else out so that they can get a spot. And competition for space is usually the primary one that you see there. Okay, this is the ocean, right? So this is like an open ocean. Open oceans are vast. They go on forever. Clear, lots of high oxygen content, right? Because you're right near the surface and you've got some wave action and everything. Surface waters are always going to be relatively high in oxygen. They're very nutrient poor, though. These are really kind of like huge, wet deserts. So in the lab supplements part under Angel, I've scanned a whole bunch of chapters out of a book that I had as a supplemental book when I took this class like 20 some odd years ago at UC Santa Cruz. And it's a series of essays by a guy named Paul Colombo on ecology. And they're very readable. They're wonderful little essays. The name of the book is Why Big Fierce Animals Are Rare. And he has a chapter in there about why big fierce animals are rare. He has a chapter on nation states of trees. And then there's a chapter in there that's called Why the Sea is Blue. You should read it. What do you think it's about? Why is the sea blue? What color should the sea be? I mean, here you've got endless amounts of water. You've got tons of sunlight. The ocean should be what color? Should be green, right? You should just have plant life galore. You should have algae everywhere. It should look like pea soup with all these little algae there, just all the water in the world, all the sunlight in the world. They should just be photosynthesizing like mad. So then the question is, why aren't they? The reason is because there's no nutrients in the surface waters of the ocean. There's virtually no nitrogen, there's no phosphorus. They can't survive without that. It's like you've got no fertilization whatsoever, no fertilizer at all for them to be able to live. And so you end up with these very, very sparse, you know, the algal coverage in ocean systems is very, very sparse because they're super nutrient limited. So what happens, though, is you periodically have these upwelling events where you bring nutrient-rich sediments up from the bottom, and then the algae go nuts. Then you have something like a red tide, where all the little dinoflagellates go, woo, look at all this nitrogen, and away they go. Very often, if you have like runoffs that are like from a field or something where you're bringing in like fertilizer from agriculture or something like that, you've got a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, you'll end up with just algae going crazy everywhere. Because that's the only thing that's holding them back. They've got all the light in the water they could ever want. That's just
My mom lives down there in Eaglewood, and she lives right on this big pond, and there's a little stream that comes down, and like all the houses and everything from all along the stream, and there's like big tunnels. I went down there when you knew, and you can just see like big tunnels of all runoff and pesticides, and just going right into the canal, which goes down the pond out right into the bay. It's just like, it is completely dark green. It's just like, you're just going nuts with all that nitrogen fixation. It's just crazy.
Yeah, that's what they need. They need nitrogen and phosphorus. It's the only thing that's limiting. And really, you'd expect the whole ocean to look like that if it had all that nitrogen and phosphorus. And it's not to say that there aren't nutrients in the ocean, but they're at the bottom. They're not on the top. And the algae, of course, can't be on the bottom. They have to be where the light is.
Do you know what causes the asthma problems when red tides are around?
No, that's a good question. But it's, so I'm going to take a total guess. We need to look that up, though. But I think that algae actually makes some kind of a encysted structure, almost like a spore or something, and that becomes airborne. I think that's, although there are toxins in red tide dinoflagellates too. For example, you're not supposed to eat shellfish when you're in the middle of a red tide because the shellfish actually consume the dinoflagellates and they accumulate the toxin, and you can get really sick if you eat shellfish when there's red tides. But as to what the airborne part of a red tide is, and obviously they smell really bad, right? And they often kill fish and stuff. It's because of the toxins that are in the dinoflagellates themselves that when they're consumed, they cause death in a lot of invertebrates and fish and things. But I'm trying to think what the airborne part is. We should look that up as to whether it's actually something being produced by the dinoflagellate or it's a byproduct of the red tide somehow. Let's look that up so I don't lie too much. Okay, so there's some little floaters, you know, phytoplankton and zooplankton, photosynthetic floating things and non-photosynthetic floating things, right? And then a whole assortment of like squid, sea turtles, and sea mammals and stuff. Squish. So there's fish and squid. So this is a coral reef, right? Coral reefs are different from some of these others in that this you really do sort of associate with a living thing, right? In the sense that it's built on the calcium carbonate skeletons of the corals. They're warm, they're shallow, they're somewhere typically reasonably near the coast, depending on the exact type of coral reef it is. They tend to be high in oxygen, even though they're very productive, and relatively limited in nutrients. Really, the productivity of the reef is held in the animals and the photosynthetic zooxanthellae things that are symbiotic with the corals. These would be analogous to the tropical rainforest for terrestrial systems in the sense that these are the real centers of biological diversity in aquatic systems. The vast number of species that you find in aquatic biomes are found in these coral reefs. So there's different types, like fringing reefs would be sort of a very young reef that would be right around the edges of, let's say, like a volcanic island or something. As the island starts to erode a little bit, it would form more of a barrier reef, which is sort of removed a little bit away from the edges of the island. And then you would end up with an atoll if the entire island eroded away. You'd end up with sort of this little circular coral ring. Lots of symbiotic algae with the corals, red algae, green algae, and then just a stunning diversity of fish and invertebrates, right? These are the really spectacular centers of biodiversity for aquatic systems. Anybody know what those are? These are tube worms. They're polychaetes, they're annelids, but these are deep sea tube worms. So this would be marine benthic zones. Obviously they could be, you know, neritic would be near the shore, you know, just on the continental shelf. Pelagic would be further out, and abyssal would be at very, very deep depths, right? And that specific zone is going to determine the temperature and the pressure. Obviously the animals that would be there would be highly adapted for whatever those specific temperature and pressure regimes were. So you could have some algae in the very shallow parts of the benthic biomes, right? But when you go into the aphotic zone, notice it doesn't mean that you can't have any autotrophs at all. You just can't have things that are photosynthetic. So there actually are like sulfur bacteria and things that are capable of chemosynthesis, so that you do have some productivity, primary productivity, and even really light limited or light not being there at all zones, right? And then there's invertebrates and some fish, and a lot of these animals too depend on food raining down from above. Now they've got all the nutrients, right? They're sitting on the bottom, so they're actually in good shape there. Okay, so let's try a couple of these. So oxygen is generally higher in higher concentration where it's surface water, moving water, cold water, or all of those. That's pretty easy, right? It's not like I'm asking you if it has determinate cleavage or something. Okay, there, right? 15?
In like population ecology. There's a lot of equations involved.
Okay, 17? Yeah, 17? Going once, going twice? Okay. aquatic systems are concentrated in bottom sediments, can be brought to the surface by upwelling, are often the most critical limiting factor, or all of those. That's the, if you guys all going, wow, the ecology stuff's pretty, that's only these questions. Is that everything? One more? One more, we lost somebody.
Yeah, no, they can't find us. Go.
Okay, it's all of those, right? Okay, so now let's do the terrestrial ones. Yeah? So unlike those that were typically characterized by whether or not the water's moving and how much oxygen is present in the water and everything, now you'll notice we're going to talk about these terrestrial biomes largely in terms of vegetation. So a lot of them, for example, are like a type of forest or something like that. But you'll notice that the vegetation, of course, is determined in turn by these abiotic factors like climate and latitude. And you'll see for some biomes it's really important to have some kind of a periodic disturbance in order to keep the biome from reverting to some other type of a biome. So this is Campbell's version of this. Notice that Campbell, I mean, high mountains and polarized kind of don't count, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different types the way Campbell does them. And you'll see that there is sort of a latitudinal effect. So for example, if you're looking at like this light green one here, I guess it's tropical forest, you see it in the tropics, right? So you see it at lower latitudes. You look at something like a northern coniferous forest, you see it at higher latitudes, right? So there is definitely a latitudinal pattern. There's also a pattern with respect to, maybe whether you're close to the coast or not for some of them. But it's not a perfect pattern either, right? I mean, you can see that there's sort of a distribution, but it's not a perfect pattern either. This is Brooker's. So if you have Brooker, and I think most of these are the same. You'll notice that Brooker has how many? 9, though, right? Brooker has 9 because we're kind of like not really counting those as biome types. Whereas Campbell just says desert. Brooker separates out a hot desert and a cold desert. Trying to think what the other difference is. Campbell, though, has chaparral as one of its biome types, and this one doesn't. This one has a tropical deciduous forest, and it contrasts it with a temperate deciduous forest. Campbell would have lumped tropical deciduous forest in with tropical rainforest. So they're slightly different, but they're largely the same. Most importantly, I just don't want you to think there's only one way to do this, right? It's artificial, right? It's just a way that people are trying to categorize and describe different types of ecosystems. But there isn't just one way to do it. Okay, so this figure here is called a climograph. And you'll notice that basically what it does is it puts annual mean precipitation along one axis, and it puts annual mean temperature along the other. Precipitation and temperature basically determine climate, climograph, right? And you'll notice that if you sort of combine those two factors, you can pretty regularly predict what type of a biome you might expect. So like a tropical rainforest, notice, is wet and hot, right? If you looked at tundra, tundra is going to be dry and cold. You might notice like this temperate broadleaf forest and a northern coniferous forest, they have roughly the same amounts of precipitation. The primary driving factor that's going to determine which type of forest you have is temperature. If the summers are just a little bit longer and warmer, you're going to go towards a temperate broadleaf forest, which basically means that the trees are deciduous. You all know what the word deciduous means? Like your deciduous teeth are you don't have them anymore. Your baby teeth. It means they fall out, right? A deciduous tree is a tree that drops its leaves in the winter, right? And grows new ones in the spring. So something like a maple or an oak or a birch or something like that. A coniferous forest, conifers are going to be things like pines and spruce and fir. They hang on to their needles, right? And it ends up that energetically, it's beneficial to actually drop your leaves and grow new ones if the summer is a little bit longer. If the summer is a little bit longer, a little bit warmer, you make these big broad leaves, you photosynthesize like mad, and then you just go whoop and drop your leaves, and then you grow new ones. If the summer is just a little bit shorter, right, it's energetically better for you to actually have small little needle-like leaves, and you put resins in them, and you just overwinter and don't lose your leaves. This is all spelled out in that chapter that Paul Colombo wrote named Nation States of Trees. It tells you why you have different forest types in different places, much better than I just did. But notice here you can kind of see it a little bit in this climograph. I know you're all thinking, you all realize, what's your final going to look like? You're all thinking about your final, right? You've all gone into that spreadsheet and you're trying to figure out, oh my God, I need to get 165 points to get a A or whatever you're shooting for, right? And you're all doing that, right? What's your final going to look like? You all know what your final's going to look like, right?
100%.
Well, okay, that'll be good. Thinking positive, 100%. No, I mean, what is it going to look like?
Okay,
You all went and got the 3 practice exams, right? And you got the 3 actual exams you took. You realize you have the whole final, right? And in fact, somebody asked me if I would put blank versions of the exams that you took, because the only ones you have are the ones you wrote on, right? They're in Angel. If you go under lessons, it says practice exam 1, exam 1, practice exam 2, exam 2, practice exam 3, exam 3. You need to print all 6 of those out. And you need to go through and answer every question. And if you've answered every question, you have taken the final. The final is going to be a subset of those questions, right? It's not going to be any longer. It's going to be like 2 off of one, 2 off another, 2 off another, 2 off another. Yeah, but you have all the questions. Not practice questions. You have the questions, the actual questions. You should be able to do really well. You have all the actual questions. And I'll even tell you what I think the answers are before you take it. You just have to somehow get those 50 questions or so into your head so you can write a reasonably good answer for it on the final. But in addition to those 200 points that you're going to get with the questions you already have, there's going to be a few ecology questions that you've never seen and that you have no practice questions for. They're extra. You don't have to answer them. You could get a perfect score on the final without ever answering the ecology questions, but if you want, you can get extra credit for those, right? So if you're short anywhere, here's a huge opportunity for you to be able to get this. But they're hard because you have no practice questions, you have no cheat sheet, right? And you also have to get it right. It doesn't have to be completely right, but it has to be at least partially right in order to get partial credit. You can't write a whole page of something that makes absolutely no sense at all, and I give you, oh, well, that's like 50% for trying or something. Because they're extra credit questions, right? So it's not like these other ones where I give you points for effort, right? You really, really have to have the answer. So you're sitting out there thinking, wow, what could this crazy guy use as an extra credit question? Here we go. Copy, paste. And then I go, what's the name of this diagram? You're never going to remember that, though. I don't think out of a class of 20 anybody got this. Because I'm going to tell you 500 other things before you do this, right? But this is the type of thing I'm going to ask you. This is right out of the book, right? So go look for it, right? And then I'll ask you something like, explain the difference or the climatic factors that determine whether or not you have a temperate forest or a northern coniferous forest. And all you'd have to do is be able to look at that and say, well, looks like it's a little bit warmer in a temperate forest than in a northern coniferous forest or something, right? I'll ask you some kind of a question about it. I'm going to take, if I use any images, I'm going to take them right out of the PowerPoint slides. Guess what this is? That's the climograph from Brooker. So if you're using Brooker, this is the picture you have. How come it looks different? How come that doesn't look like this? Here they all look like they're up here. Here it looks like they're all down there. Why is that?
There's the precipitation.
Yeah, they just switched the axes, that's all. Yeah, but it's basically the same idea. Notice they've got slightly different. They've got like cold deserts and hot deserts. They're separating out, whereas Campbell just sort of has deserts. And it just looks weird because it's running this way instead of running that way because the axes are reversed and stuff. Yeah. Okay, so here we go. Here are the terrestrial biomes. This is a tropical rainforest, right? Tropical rainforests are wet. You could actually pull out temperate rainforest as a separate type. I think that Campbell would lump that probably under a northern coniferous forest. But when I was in Juneau, Alaska, that's a temperate rainforest. It's the Tonga, whatever, national forest there. It's the largest temperate rainforest, I think, in North America. It rains all the time in Juneau, right? Right on the coast, you got lots of spruce and fir, but it's a rainforest. It rains all the time. But it's not warm, right? It's cold. Very often in the tropics, they don't really have seasons, right? If you've ever been to a tropical area or lived in one, they don't talk so much about like winter and summer. Instead, they sort of talk about like the rainy season and the dry season. So the rain can be seasonal. It's not like it just rains all the time, but when it does rain, it rains a lot. It's wet. They tend to be warm because they're in the tropics. Obviously, if you're in slightly higher elevations, it would be less warm. But there's not a whole lot of temperature fluctuation. The day length doesn't change, right? If you're right on the equator, you really don't notice changes in day length or seasons or anything like that. Not like winter and summer things. Broadleaf evergreen trees. These are angiosperms, whole different kinds of flowering plants. Epiphytes galore, right? So because you have these tall trees, there's lots of little plants that go, gee, I want to get close to the light, so they live up on top of other plants. That's what this means. Epa means on top of, phyte means plant. So things like bromeliads and orchids, and there's a whole host of them. And here I've chickened out and just said insects, spiders, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. That could be anything, right? It's obviously going to depend on exactly if you're in a tropical rainforest in Java. That's going to look different than one that's in Brazil, right? These have tremendously high levels of diversity. If you want to make a career of naming new species, you should go to a tropical rainforest or a coral reef. This is where the vast majority of species diversity exists, right? This is a desert, and most people think of deserts as being hot, but if you've ever been in a desert, you know at night they can get very cold, and there actually are cold deserts that are kind of cold all the time. That's why Berger separates them out that way. And you probably don't think of deserts as having a lot of plants, but I'll tell you one of the most spectacular things I can remember doing in recent time was driving from Phoenix down to Tucson right after the spring rains. I did that a few years ago, and the entire desert is just awash in flowers. It's stunning. I've never seen flowers like that anywhere. And it's because they only get 2 weeks to do it. So everybody does it all at once, and it's phenomenal, right? You have these fast blooming annuals, things that basically complete their whole life in like a week and a half or something like that. They have to grow into a plant, make all their flowers, go to seed, and then just sit out there and bake in the sun for a year as a seed until it rains again, right? So very impressive. If you hit a desert at just the right time, right after the rains, it's amazingly beautiful, right? So the precipitation is relatively low, and it's very seasonal, so that you just get rains at certain times. And temperatures are extreme. Plants are specifically adapted to this, so things like succulents that store water in their roots and stems and leaves, more in their leaves and stems. Deep-rooted herbs that can tap into water that's far below, and then plants that finish their life history very quickly. So reptiles, scorpions, beetles, there's obviously some birds and mammals, right? This is?
Savannah.
Huh?
Savannah.
A savanna. Where does it look like we are there?
Africa.
Like Africa, right? So think of the Lion King, all your little friends from the Lion King, Savannah. This is a tropical grassland. We're going to look at a temperate grassland in a second. So these have moderate seasonal rainfall. They're in the tropics, right? They're warm. There's some seasonal variation. Most of these grasslands, including the temperate ones, you need to have fires move through periodically, and if you didn't, they would actually just revert to some kind of a forest. So you actually need that disturbance in order to keep it as a grassland. Obviously, there's grass, right? Scattered trees, and of course, if you look at these trees here that make it look so much like Africa, these are acacias. Do y'all know acacias? They're in the same family with things like peas and beans. They're legumes, basically. It ends up that the genus Acacia, if you take all of the species that are described worldwide, there's a whole bunch of acacias. There's one that's endemic to the Hawaiian Islands, Acacia koa, and then there's a bunch of acacias that are in Australia, and it ends up that if you take the entire genus, it's not monophyletic. You all know what that means now, right? That's bad. And so they have to try to fix that somehow, and the way that they fix it, according to the rules of botanical nomenclature, the species that was first named in the genus Acacia and all of its relatives are the ones that get to keep the name Acacia. Everybody else has to get a new name. It ends up that the first species described in the genus Acacia is one of the Australian ones, not one of the African ones. And yet most people do not associate Acacia with Australia, they associate it more with Africa. All of these African acacias are not going to be acacias anymore, they're all going to be transferred to another genus. As painful as that is, I'm going to probably keep calling them acacias even though they're not going to be. Then I'm going to have to say, you know, prairie dogs aren't dogs, acacias aren't acacias, right? Horrible, right? So insects, large herbivores, right? So you picture like little gazelles and giraffes and stuff, and a few predators out there like a lion here, a lion there, and a hyena here. Hyenas are more scavengers, I guess. But. And so this is me and my friend George. He's from Kenya. He works now at the National Museum in Nairobi. And so I went to Kenya with him in 2006, and he took me all over. This is in the Great Rift Valley of Africa. This is Lake Nakuru. And we had come in on in a little Jeep, coming along these roads here. There were rhinos out here just running around. I know there were zebras in like everybody's yard. I mean, like if you, anything you could have ever imagined that Africa would be, it is amazing. I mean, I was excited to go, and I had never been there. It was unbelievable. I remember I took like all of this roll of, well, not a roll of film, but like a whole cartridge of film of a baboon when I saw a baboon outside. And then I realized they have baboons kind of like we have squirrels around here. So everybody's like looking at me like, oh my God, what's this guy freaking out over a baboon? Because they're everywhere. In fact, you kind of have to watch out. Like in Zima Springs when we went to see the hippos and stuff, all the little monkeys descend on the car and they go around and they're really good. They know to check all the handles, and if you leave anything on the car unlocked, they'll get in the car because they're looking for food. And like this is in Naivasha, Lake Naivasha, which is near Lake Nakuru, and these are in Tsavo National Park. I took these pictures. And I mean, is that easy to take pictures of like 8 buffalo? I had been there for a couple of weeks and I hadn't seen elephants, and then at the very end we were headed up this dusty road. And I mean, you just drive into these national parks and go forever and ever and ever. You don't see any people at all. And then all of a sudden you come across like this herd of elephants that are just sitting there on the side of the road. It's just amazing. Y'all got to go to Africa here. Okay, so how about this? This is kind of a weird one. This is one I probably wouldn't count as a biome type, and Brooker skips this. It's familiar to me because we have these in California. And they would have them like in Italy and Portugal and places like that. It's sort of associated with Mediterranean type areas. It's called a chaparral. Have you ever heard of that? I'm not sure I pulled this out as a biome type. They have Mediterranean climate, which is the winters are rainy and the summers are dry. If you've ever lived in California, you know it doesn't rain in the summertime. It was weird to me when I went to Chicago and it rains in like July. And like here, even when it rains in July, that seems odd to me. In California, it does not rain from about like late May to September, October. It just doesn't rain at all. So rains in the winter, it's dry in the summer. The summers are reasonably warm, the winters are cool, but it's quite moderate compared to a lot of these biomes that we're talking about. And a chaparral is just characterized by little oaks and grasses and shrubs and stuff. You might have like little deer, goats and stuff running around in there. Very often these are associated with serpentine soils, which are a special type of soil that has a lot of heavy metals and things, and they have a whole specific type of vegetation that grows on them. But I don't know why Campbell pulls this out as a separate biome type. It's kind of a very minor biome type. This now is a, well, what does that look like? Grassland. It's just not a tropical grassland. This would be a temperate grassland. So now instead of thinking of Kenya, we're thinking of Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa. And there are other temperate grasslands throughout the world. If you've heard of like the Russian steppes, you've all heard of the Russian steppes? Those are Russian grasslands, temperate grasslands. How about the Pampas of Argentina? Okay. The Pampas of Argentina are temperate grasslands. Yeah, that gives you at least a couple examples. So we can imagine though Kansas, if that's more familiar to you, right, would be kind of the same. Dry winters, wet summers, although the winter's going to be really snowy, right? If you're in an area that's cold enough. So there's grasses, obviously, small shrubs, and again you need fires in order to keep it as a grassland. And then you can have sort of large grazers, so instead of having like gazelles and zebras and stuff, you have bison and prairie dogs. Okay. This is a northern coniferous forest, or a taiga is the other name that's used for this, T-A-I-G-A. These have relatively high annual precipitation. The winters are brutal here, though, and the summers are relatively short. If the summers were just a little longer, most of these would probably revert to deciduous forests, but they don't because the summers are a little bit too short. So these are dominated by conifers, so things like pine and spruce, fir, hemlock, and then you have a whole assortment of like birds and stuff that would be here, along with moose and bear and deer. And this is now going to be what? This is a temperate deciduous forest, right? Or a broadleaf forest. It looks kind of like Vermont, maybe, or something, right? You can see, you imagine these are all probably maples or oaks or something like that that turn colors in the fall because they're going to drop their leaves. Y'all know why they turn colors, right?
Change in sunlight?
Well, what cues the change of color is probably change in daylight or something like that, yeah. But I mean, why, like, where was all this red and yellow and orange and stuff? Where was that before? Where's it coming from, you know? It's actually in the leaves all the time, right? Those are carotenoids and anthocyanins and things like that, and xanthophylls that are in the leaf all the time. But what happens in the fall is rather than just drop a nice green leaf with all that pigment in it, the plant starts to metabolize the pigments and pull them out of the leaves, right? And so it metabolizes the chlorophylls first, and when it metabolizes the chlorophylls and pulls them out of the leaf, what you see is what's left behind. But those colors are actually in the leaves all the time, right? Okay, so the winters are cold, but the summers are a little bit longer, such that this is energetically favored, this idea of actually dropping your leaves and getting new ones in the springtime. The trees are deciduous, there's the word, right? That means the leaves drop off. These are hardwoods as opposed to the conifers are softwood. You all remember when we talked about that, meaning that they're angiosperms, right? Maples and oaks and beeches, all that are all angiosperm hardwoods, as opposed to fir and spruce and pine are all softwood gymnosperms. And there's, yeah, notice I'm getting sloppier. I just go mammals, birds, and insects. So there's a whole bunch of different types there. And this, what's that? This is tundra. So this looks very much like Denali National Park in Alaska, where I went last summer. I'd never seen a tundra before, and it's bizarre because, of course, you don't have plants that get very big at all. You mostly have like these little mosses and lichens and things that are very close to the ground. I actually took a bus ride on basically a yellow school bus for 14 hours. I drank a bunch of coffee in the morning. There's no bathrooms. That's what I most remember about it. Here we are going past the Polychrome Mountains, and all I could think is I really want a bathroom. So I went all the way to the very end of the road to Kantishna, which is as far inside of Denali as you can go. And that whole area is a resort where there's lots of, people and little shops and restaurants and everything. It's open for like 2 months out of the year. And then they leave like one caretaker there to try to overwinter. It's very near the point, you know that guy that went, what's his name, Kansas or whatever, Call of the Wild? Into the Wild? Where the guy went, he died in a school bus or whatever. They made a movie about it a couple of years ago. It's very close to there, where that was. In fact, they have the bus that was used in the movie. You take a picture in front of it and all that kind of stuff. But it looks very much like this, right? And Denali National Park is beautiful because you can see Mount McKinley in the distance, and it's very picturesque, but they really don't want you to, you can't take any food in, they don't want you to walk around anywhere, partially because there's bears all over the place. We saw lots of bears going in. But you also, they don't want you to step on any of the plants, because these little teeny plants, as small as they are, they grow really slowly, and you could like squash out like 5 years of growth just by doing that. So they really are very protective of having anybody disturb anything. Not a whole lot of rain, right? You can think of this almost as a very big, cold desert, right? The winters are undescribably brutal. The summers are really short and mild. There's this thing called permafrost, which means if you go down just a couple inches, the soil basically is frozen year-round. Even in the summertime, it only thaws to, a depth like that, and below that, it's all frozen. Very tiny little plants. You're not going to have anything that needs to have deep roots because it can't establish deep roots. It's frozen just a couple inches under the ground. But you do have these grazers that feed on these little teeny tiny plants, things like musk ox and caribou, reindeer, wolves, bears. I think it's almost all of those. You can see a wolf, I think. And then lots of birds, and of course birds go up to nest in the summertime.